What you want. That's why you do this. One of those quotes you have to think about. It's not like Oscar Wilde that you get right away, you know. But think about that. Intellectual passion is the kind of passion that will get you going the whole of your life. It usually can last your lifetime. It doesn't need to be nurtured. If you've got it, it goes on. And it comes when you know enough about the real world to assess the implication of what you know. And sometimes the implications are of no consequence, and sometimes they're incredible. And when that happens, things start to change, things happen in your own life. I found that intersection when I was 49 years old in 1995. Our next speaker found it much sooner and pursued essentially the most implicative, important issue in the history of the human race. It's that simple. The Washington Post has not figured that out yet, but one day they will. And then I'm going to go on radio and just really beat up on them. But that's another issue, okay? How hard is it to be? How hard is it to know something so profound at a time when so many can't accept it? This is not easy. Most of you are in that position, right? But not all of you are prepared to go out in the world and take that position and confront it. But whatever you do, whatever choice you make, whether to spectate, research, be involved, if you can find an intellectual passion, I tell you, it's incredibly satisfying. This is a man that could get you there real easily. And all I can say is that when the history of this time is written, and they start to go back and they look in all the cracks and crevices and start getting all those tapes out and all those interviews and everything else, and try to figure out what happened, when, and why, and who did what, and if they're judicious and they're fair, they're going to find that Dr. Stephen Greer played a very significant role. Got a lot of criticism for it. Took a lot of hits. But that's the way it is. You look at every major activist and agent of change in the history of our time, whether it's King or Gandhi or so many others. It was tough. They took a lot of hits. They made a lot of history. Well, I hope this conference makes some history. And Stephen Greer is part of it, and he has an open invitation to always be part of it. So let's give him another round of applause.
Thank you, Steve. I'm glad to be here again. I just want to ask if anyone is here who was not in the lecture. Oy vey. Okay, a few. This is problematic because about how many people were in the lecture? 2/3. In the interest of not being too redundant, I'm not going to go over everything I did in the lecture here because it just isn't fair to everyone else. Is there anyone here who doesn't know what the Disclosure Project is and what it's been doing? Very few. Okay, so then we're all sort of on a level playing field. You could have skipped my lecture anyway. Well, I'm Dr. Stephen Greer. I'm an emergency doctor, and this is a more intimate setting, so we're going to make this a more intimate thing. I'm going to say some introductory comments, and then I'm going to open it to you because I think Socratic works better than didactic. And whatever your questions are and what you need to know is what I want to speak to because this is some private time together. And I believe that the most important thing that I want to say in sort of introductory is that the project that we're working on really has gone worldwide and has created other movements within movements. And what I mean here is that the big action, are we getting a lot of feedback? The big action, I feel, has always been in getting ideas out, getting knowledge out. And if the ideas are out and the knowledge is out, then people can begin to understand the world around them, and that can lead to change. there's some exciting things that are happening in that regard. There's a large mainstream diplomatic journal, not, as you may have read, on the disinformation internet. The Council of Foreign Relations Foreign Affairs Journal is another one. And they are going to do an expose on this, and this is subscribed to by every prime minister and secretary of state and what have you in the world. And they're going to, I wrote an article that talks about the consequences of illegal secrecy and what it's doing to the world and what it's doing to humanity. And that's going to be coming out this summer in a special edition of that journal. So what we find is that there's an enormous interest in this matter, even though it gets the ha-ha kind of factor and silly factor a lot, in circles that need to be taking this seriously. John Q. Public, about 50–55%, depending on the study you see, know that there's something to the UFO issue and that the government's quote-unquote lying about it. But that's a very blunt sort of instrument. The question is, what's the government? Whose government? Which government? What government? It was not the one at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue necessarily, or at the Congress. There's a shadowy government, to quote Senator Inouye, who during the Iran-Contra hearing said, with its own Air Force, its own military, its own funding mechanism, its own structure, and it answers to its own rules and its own laws. That's what we're talking about. And that's been said by senators, it's been said by mainstream people. It doesn't get a lot of airtime in press because the press, the big media, as opposed to the little media, are part of that problem and part of that structure, quite frankly. It's our job then, I feel, to get the truth out, heart to heart, person to person. And I would encourage people to become representatives of the Disclosure Project, get the National Press Club tape with these witnesses on your local cable access. It's available for free. You can download it off our site, put it on your cable access channel, whatever you want to do. It's really people taking an activist. What is going on here? Is there an AV person in the house who can fix this? Yeah, okay. So, I personally think that we have to own responsibility for the world we live in. And in my opinion, we have done a very poor job of marshaling the truth on this issue and holding our government and the big media to what is necessary. We've let them get away with murder, and it's time that we call them on it. And that's really one of the central thrusts of what we're doing. Now, underneath that is a sort of a more profound question. And this gets, I was just asked in a television interview about this, and that is, but if some of these UFOs are extraterrestrial, and it means we're not alone, what are the implications of that? And they're huge. And it crosses almost every discipline. We have the responsibility to frame our future in that regard and not have it framed for us by disinformation hacks that would like to set up another, in my opinion, conflict between us and them. And I think one of the biggest concerns I have as I look around this particular field, this particular area, is the fact that we have an enormous number of people who are putting disinformation out into public domain, which is designed to divide peoples against each other. Now, of course, Hitler did a great job of that, trying to turn his population against Jews. And, of course, there's been propaganda by every nation state against their enemy to portray them in a monstrous and dehumanized way. Unfortunately, I'm telling you that for about 50 years that's been going on the UFO subject. And what that means is that they've been trying to prime the pump for conflict. And they do it by portraying... Closer? Yeah. Oh, okay. If the closer is loud. I'm kind of a loud mouth guy. Is that better? All right. Then, and I think that we have to own responsibility for this extremely unfortunate situation that's evolving. And that is the launch of Star Wars off-planet into space and against others. You know, I had a Defense Intelligence Agency guy that I've worked with for a number of years, retired now, who said, you know, way back in the 60s, he was looking at some of these things. He says, well, these things are looking out there. We have some birds. What are we doing? And the fact is that we have already weaponized systems that have targeted these vehicles with the intention of bringing them down. and we have successfully brought them down. I have multiple people, independent, corroborating witnesses who have been at facilities where this has happened and where we have targeted these objects to knock them down or bring them down. You say, how can you do that if they're that advanced? I said, well, you can if you understand EMPs, electromagnetic pulse weapons, and a whole area of weapon systems that have been developed for 40 or 50 years. So there is an acute need for people to get educated on the subject, get their minds around it, and not fall for the trap of disinformation. And I think that that's one of the big challenges of our time. I'm attached to this, you know. Oh, okay. I'm in an electromagnetically altered area. This is nothing new. What my aspirations are, and the thing that keeps me going on this is I look at the world, I look at the earth, and I look at my children, and I go, what kind of world are we creating and are we going to leave? And if a few of us can make some kind of difference, and I look at myself, you know, doing the best I can as one man, if it makes even a tiny difference on something this significant, it's worth every effort. And a lot of people get into these things, well, you know, I've given up my medical career, I've basically given up millions of dollars in income and assets to get this thing launched. I have other people on my team who put huge amounts of time and energy and effort into this, and you go, well, are you really tilting at windmills? And I go, well, you know, you can't judge the future by looking around you now, and you can. I take a very Zen approach to it and say, I got to do what I think is the right thing to do and let the future take care of itself in that sense. But if you're doing the right thing in the present, the future will be better. You can't control all the implications of what you're going to be doing, but if you stay in right action, a very philosophical view in my opinion, then it will happen in the best outcome. There's a wonderful Zen saying, you know, sometimes you have to yield and overcome. But there are other times where you really have to apply. This is a time where we have to engage, and we have to engage and create our future. That's the good future that's awaiting humanity. Unfortunately, that isn't going to happen by you thinking that there are some people in the power structure who are going to make these changes for us. It never happens that way. It always comes out of left field or right field or up there or down there or what have you, and I guess that's where I'm coming out of some sort of trajectory. And then it catches on with people and they make these things happen. Ultimately, the future that we're going to create is the one that we have to begin to design now. What I tell people is that about a 5,000 century era has opened, 500,000 year cycle, in my opinion. And we're at this interface between one closing and one opening. And it's like an embryo in the womb. Everything you do to it has a lot of implications to that organism as it evolves through the fetus state and into birth. We're at this embryonic stage of moving out of a civilization that's in adolescence, fighting with each other, acting crazy. It's like a teenage boy that's stolen the keys to his dad's Corvette and is racing around the freeway and doesn't really know how to drive. But we've got to get this right, and we have to do it by intentionally seeing the future ahead of us and saying, this is the future we want. And it's not one of escalating from conflict on Earth to conflict in space. It's not one from going from one kleptocracy that's controlling these issues and keeping things secret to benefit a few to a different kleptocracy. It has to be a totally different world. And that's really what I think the bottom line is what's happening. It's happening on many levels, and it's creating a lot of chaos. I have felt for years that one of my chief jobs is articulating these larger themes and also getting them to the people who put their pants on one leg at a time, just like we all do, or skirts or whatever, and who have the responsibility of managing these programs. And I have found that a lot of them are amenable to these ideas, and they are not altogether against the concepts of what you're hearing here about getting the information out. About 40 or 45% of the so-called MJ-12, not current name in my opinion, control group, shadow group that runs these things is in favor of that. Back in 1993, when I briefed President Clinton's first CI director, it was about a third of them. So I think that we're moving in the right direction. Now, my concern, will it be too little too late? because there are forces in history and forces in the environment that are propelling us to a very definite outcome. And you know, the Chinese have some delicious little sayings, and one of them is unless we change directions, we're likely to end up where we're going. Well, nobody thinks, where are we going? And of course we have to change directions, but where we're headed is that we're on a terminal trajectory as a civilization. And this is known by a lot of people, by the way. And this terminal trajectory is something that we have to intercept and move it back on course. Because I am absolutely certain that 50 to 100 years of human evolution have been thwarted or hijacked or perverted by vested interests that are centered in myopia, greed, power mongering, and unfortunately even worse elements that are addicted to conflict and war. We're at the point in our history where those things have got to get sorted out, and pretty quickly, because we don't really have time to spend another century. We have maybe a few years to get a lot of these issues sorted out before we're on a very serious meltdown and collision with the future. So I think everyone here who's hearing these things, a lot of it may be a lot to take initially. Thanks, bud. Appreciate it. It's time for me to wake up. And I think that if we have enough courage to stay the course, we'll see it through. And I would encourage all of you to ask yourselves, what can you do to be able to be an agent of change? You know, because we are really in need of a lot of people understanding what the implications are and stepping up to the plate and not just being passive consumers of information. You know, the media, the big media, made of all of us couch potatoes and passive consumers. And I tell people, you've got to go from knowledge to action or nothing changes. And that's what I encourage people to do. And I hope all of you will consider what you can do to make that happen. What I want to do, because we just have so little time together, and most of you were in the lecture, I wanted to open this up to your questions. I'm going to ask you to just stand up, ask your question, I'll repeat it, and we're going to do this in a Socratic way. Do not stand up and launch into a diatribe or a lecture, but you're free to stand up and ask a question, and I'll address it. Be warned, if you ask me a question, I'll answer it. So be careful what you ask for. And number two, a question might have an answer that takes 30 minutes. And I apologize in advance, but some questions require 30 minutes of explanation to get there. So is there a mic for people to ask questions in, or do they just? All right, we'll just yell. There's a gentleman here. He's patiently holding up his hand.
You didn't address the idea of treaties between the governments or shadow government of the U.S. and the extraterrestrials. Could you talk about that and how that might be used as leverage to go before government leaders and say, look, these guys are trumping you. You shouldn't like that. I mean, could you address that?
Well, I think there's a lot of information that we really can't establish as true or false at this point. One of them is that there's some kind of shadowy connection between some extraterrestrial civilizations and humans of some type. I'm personally very, very skeptical of that. I seriously doubt it exists today, if it ever did. I think there are reasons why people would like you to think it does. My own sense and my own experience with the UFOs themselves and with this covert group is that it's nowhere nearly that organized on the human end. Although the technology programs are, but the relationships aren't. And I think that this is one of the biggest questions, is that who speaks for humanity and who speaks for planet Earth? Because of the stranglehold of these corrupt influences. And believe me, this is the mafia or RICO of all times. In terms of a RICO Act violation, you know, the Racketeering Influence Corrupt Organization Act. Basically, you have interests that have kept the public out of the knowledge of this, and in that vacuum of secrecy, neither the people nor their representatives have been able to step up to the plate to do the right thing, if you will, diplomatically about this issue. Now, does that mean that in that vacuum there has stepped some folks who have represented us without our consent to other civilizations? I don't think so, although they may have tried. My own sense is that humans, whether that exists or not, humans have to get educated about this and empower ourselves to determine that relationship. And if you look back to 1990 through 1993, the very first thing that we did was to go out in sort of a prospective research model, go out to areas where there were a lot of these UFOs being reported and try to establish contact with them, and we did. And what we found was that they were very interested in interacting with humans coming from a certain state of awareness. And I don't mean just a higher state of consciousness, although that's part of it, but a certain philosophical focus, one that was open and non-paranoid and non-military. I had a former head of Army intelligence, an NSA guy, and his whole team come to me after we had vectored in 3 of these, or actually it was 4, but 3 that came very close, of these objects on the Florida coast near Pensacola back in the 90s, and came in and signaled to us for about 20 minutes. What's interesting, there are videotapes and photographs of this. What's interesting is that hit all the hot buttons in that group, because they said, how did you figure out what you're doing, how you're doing that? I said, well, that goes back to when I was 8 years old. You know, there's a reason why I'm here. I mean, you just don't wake up one day in the ER and say, I'm going to follow this issue. So what I found personally was that these life forms are very eager to try to have a positive and open relationship with humanity, but they're not able to because the mass organs of communication, the corrupt media, and the mass financial and technology world has kept this thing sequestered out of a serious look by our diplomatic elders, our spiritual elders, many of these people. I remember in 1994 and 95 working with the family of the Secretary General of the United Nations, and Mrs. Boutros-Ghali was very interested and very supportive of what we were trying to do. And I actually gave a lecture at the United Nations that she attended, and some senior diplomats attended, that was entitled "The Foundations of Interplanetary Peace." And it sounds, you got to be kidding. You know, I said, no, I mean, this was a serious thing. And it was talking about what is required of humans in our thinking, in our worldview, in our paradigm, in terms of going from where we are today to having a satisfactory relationship down the road with extraterrestrial civilizations. Now, it isn't going to be down the barrel of a laser or an electromagnetic pulse weapon. All the fantasies that somehow we're going to have some sort of Star Wars solution to all this is all nothing but propaganda that aggrandizes one and only one special interest group, the multi-trillion-dollar military-industrial laboratory corporate complex that wants us to export conflict out of Iraq and out of Earth into space and make it on a larger scale than you can imagine. If you think the Cold War was expensive, wait till you see the price tag these guys are calculating for Star Wars. It's up way many trillions. And I think that this manipulation is something that's very dangerous, and this is why I've been advocating, and this is why I continue to work with mainstream diplomatic and international people to say, look, we really need to have the ability as a people to go forward and connect with these civilizations, and we determine that outcome. Not have a small group of people who are myopic and are focused, in my opinion, through a lens that is very conflict-oriented or very retrograde, very backward thinking, or eschatological. You know, eschatology is the study of how the world's going to end, and you have a whole cell of this covert group that are hard-boiled eschatologists. A lot of people laugh when they hear that, and I say, well, people forget that James Watts, who was Reagan's Interior Secretary, when he left a mic open at a conference, said, you know, we don't need to worry about the environment. This is the Secretary of the Interior of the United States in office, because since the end of the world's going to be happening soon, Jesus wants all of us just to enjoy it and use it up while it's here, because it's going to end anyway. Now, this is the person executing policy for the most powerful country in the world. If you think that that thinking doesn't infect every level of covert programs, you are living in a fantasy world. The fact is that one's perspective and understanding, your level of consciousness, drives everything else. And so much of this has been driven off a cliff because of very primitive, atavistic, superstitious and crazy thinking, whether it's us against them thinking militarily, or weird religious ideas, or misinterpretations of spiritual prophecy, or whatever it is. And that is what's going on in these little covert circles, in addition to the power grab to put something into a black box and keep it secret, lest big oil go the way of all flesh. So I think that when you bring up this question of relationship between humans and other civilizations, regardless of what it is today or may have happened in the past, and as I said, I'm rather skeptical that it's as formalized as some people would say, we, the people who understand where we are today and understand where we will be in 1,000 years and 5,000 years and 500,000 years, need to step up to the plate and say, here's what this relationship needs to evolve through. And this is the understanding we need to bring to it. And it crosses over into an understanding of a sort of ineffable oneness that emanates from conscious, intelligent life forms. Even the Vatican people I've met with, like Monsignor Balducci, was very upfront with me about the fact that he doesn't think any of these are at all hostile, and that, in fact, that we have more in common than we have that's dissimilar, because by definition, if you're a conscious, sentient, intelligent life form, you're capable of being aware of awareness, aware of the Great Spirit. So there is a fundamental oneness that can be shared with these beings, and it's on a very profound level. And I think every wise person knows this. Unfortunately, you have people who have much smaller worldviews and much narrower interpretations and live through fear and paranoia and greed, who have hijacked this. And here's the problem. You know what the problem with nice people? The problem with nice people is that they're nice. It's a real problem. Because if you have assholes, and there are a bunch of them out there, and they have the means and the willingness to be ruthless and murderous, nice people get bowled over. And it's the aggressive, primitive ones that prevail. That's the world we live in. You can put any kind of smiley face you want other than that. So what's the solution? It means that nice people need to evolve into spirit warriors, what they used to call the Shambhala warriors, people who would understand, yes, this is what needs to be done. We're going to do it from a very clear spiritual perspective, but we're going to be tough, and no one's going to intimidate us. So we're going to do it, and we're going to stay the course. And there are certain people who I classify into that kind of category of awake people who are willing to stay the course and will not be intimidated, all through history. And that's the only way change happens, when you have an enormous, ruthless, and negative influence of folks who are not particularly nice, many of them. Unfortunately, even within this shadowy group that people refer to, there are some very, very good people. But they are terrorized, I use this word advisedly in the era of terror, by folks who are in this program who scare the hell out of them and have shown what they will do if they step out of line. And it doesn't take many people to terrorize a large number of people, as we have seen in our society. So these are all issues that have got to be addressed, and I think that the best way to resolve any of these questions is to go out there and find out for ourselves. This is why I've said to people for years, why don't we form a citizens' diplomatic effort reaching out to these civilizations? Why not? CSETI has been doing it for 14 years without funding. If you had any governmental entity provide a true capability for that, we could just bypass this whole secret structure. You think they've got a lock on communicating with these civilizations? How many people here have had a close encounter with a UFO or ET vehicle? Several people. There is no way that they have a lock on it. Thank God. So what I say to people is that we have to empower ourselves and quit acting passive. You can be nice and active, is what I'm saying. There are some nice alpha males out there in the world, and alpha females. So, you know, if you've got to be an alpha, but be a nice alpha. You can do it. And that's one of the really, in my opinion, a true requirement of the current era. And we have totally dropped the ball as a people. This is one reason why, by the way, a lot of people like to sit back with their conspiracy theories and blame some big power structure or secret group. I said, no. Go look in the mirror. If you know what the truth is and you're not doing something to correct the situation, you're it. You're where you can't control what the CEO of Lockheed does, but you can control what you do, and then you can educate and bring into some positive action those in your orbit. And if you don't exert that effort, then you have no one to blame but yourself. A lot of people see the task ahead, and I'm guilty of this sometimes, and lately it's been a hard time for me, quite frankly. And you want to give up, and you want to say, oh my God, this is impossible, and it's just, I'm fed up with it. And, you know, I mean, God, I've been called everything in the name, and you can imagine, it's just horrible. And being in the position I'm in hasn't been a very pleasant thing. I mean, death threats and this thing and that thing. 3 people in my inner circle in the 90s were killed. I was almost killed. 3 of us got metastatic cancer the same month. I'm the only one left living. A former CI director, as I told you earlier, who was helping us, was whacked. You know, we had some horrible things happen back in the mid and late 90s until we put our own positive alphas in charge of security. No one's bothering us now. No one. All right, that sounds ominous, and it is ominous. So, you know, the week before I did the 2001 disclosure event, I went over to a think tank near the Pentagon, met with some spooks who were riding my case and saying, what the hell are you doing? And I said, you know what we're doing because you're watching what we're doing in real time, the fact that they've proven to me many times. And I said, I've got hundreds of these guys lined up to come out, and they're going to keep coming out. And I said, let me tell you something. You're either going to help or you're going to stand down out of the way. If you threaten one of these men, and there are a few women involved in this witness group, or anyone working with me, or anyone working with them, you're all dead men walking. Now, people hear that and they are horrified. And I said, look, don't ask, don't tell. I don't even have to inquire about it. It's set up. Once these things start happening, I turned to some people, I said, make it happen. Just put it in place. Because we want peace, and we want to create an open and free civilization here, which we do not have by any means right now. But if you're not willing to stand up to the schoolyard bully, they will terrorize an entire school. And that's what has to happen. And somebody's got to stand up to that. And by the way, people ask me many times about, you know, am I afraid? I said, well, if I were the type of person to respond to fear, I'd be terrified. But the truth is, I don't respond to that. Never have. I just don't. You know, I just plunge in, do what I think is right. I wasn't always that way. You know, Senator McCain just came out with a book about courage. And he said, ordinary people can exhibit enormous courage. And that's what I'm trying to say. We're ordinary people. You know, I go to the Pentagon, and my stock line is that now that I live out here in Virginia near Monticello, and I have a home in D.C. also, and I go there to the Pentagon, and I'll meet with these guys. I'll say, no, I'm just a country doctor from Virginia. But here's what I found out about this, and here's what we're going to have to do. I make it very clear that there's no authority vested in me other than that what I've wanted to set for myself. And that's true of every one of us. We create absolutely our own reality. We have our own power. We use it or not. And you know, when Bill Clinton's inner circle came to me and asked me to brief his CI director and his science advisor, and I put together stuff for Lawrence Rockefeller to take to the ranch to sit with Hillary and Bill back in 94 and 95, that's what all that was about. Y'all know that story? Oh, God. Well, it was fun. But, you know, the thing is that one of these guys came back to my house after I spent 3 hours with the CI director, gave him a briefing document this thick, and then a white paper that said, here's what you need to do. And he looked at me, he says, well, how do we disclose something I don't have access to? I said, then you get access. And he just blanched. And I see, because he knew what I was saying. Well, a few weeks later, an FOB, it's a friend of Bill Clinton, they're called FOBs, came to my house and said, Dr. Greer, you know, and this guy was a really kind of a bag man for the Democratic Party, big, you know, fat, you know, sort of big political guy, and not in public office, was sort of behind the scenes and sort of an apparatchik in the machinery. And he said, well, they're convinced that Clinton will end up like Jack Kennedy if he does what you're recommending. And I burst out laughing. This is January of 94. And I went, ha, 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 10 years ago. He says, no, they're serious. And I went, what? My wife is there, who's, you know, Ivy League educated and this and that. And we weren't much into the fact that many of these conspiracies could really be at that level. And he says, oh, no, they're serious. I said, you're telling me you can't secure the protective services of the President of the United States if he pushes on this hard? He said, that's what they're afraid of. They're not going to do it. I went, Mother of God, we are in a jackpot. And I have since heard this from other people. So there's a lot of fear. And so what I tell people is that fear, whether it's of some coalition that exists that's all powerful, fear creates its own illusion. Don't be deceived by fear. And I tell people, look at the bright future that we can have. I tell people you can go into all these scary things, but imagine a world where these technologies are brought out for peaceful uses, and that the world community has decided decisively they will only be used for peaceful purposes. And believe me, if we make that decision, we can enforce it. We have the means to do it today. Absolutely. Every home will have its own power generator without being connected to a grid or using fuel, free energy. Every vehicle, we will have no roads between cities. It'll all be above ground. We will have no poverty in the world. Within 20 years, we can eliminate poverty as we know it will be abolished. And all the environmental damage that's being done, not just from fossil fuels, but the secondary and tertiary and quaternary ramifications of the systems we use. For example, a lot of people don't realize, Buckminster Fuller told me back in 70s that we already had the technologies to scrub to zero all the effluent from every manufacturing, smokestack, recycling, and water. What was the rate limiting problem? Energy cost. And the energy systems that are used pollute so much and cost so much that to take it to that level isn't viable. But if you introduce this other element, what I call the big third element in energy, so that you do not need to have a high cost for your energy use because it's being extracted from the quantum vacuum flux field or the zero-point energy field, boom, you have the ability to create true sustainability and abundance that will go for thousands and thousands and thousands of years if we can live peacefully together. And if we can't, then that's another whole question. So we're at this crossroads, and really, we're going to have to accept the fact that we're going to have to live together peacefully. We're going to have to bring out these technologies, and we're going to have the means nationally and internationally to enforce a peace. Because the first 100 years or 200 years of this are going to be a peace of chained dogs. I hate to tell you. You know, it's not like you're going to wave a magic wand, Pollyannish, and humans become angels. Ain't going to happen. Not that quickly. The only question I have is what kind of trauma beyond World War I and World War II and 9/11 and these other things are we going to have to go through before we get it? When are we going to learn this fundamental lesson that we have to live together peacefully and put the means to enforce it? None of these technologies are going to be able to come out unless we have peace. And yet we can't have peace without the technologies. We are really in a catch-22. So we're going to have to lead it on both fronts simultaneously. They both have to happen at the same time. There's another question. Yes, sir. Yes. Right. You know what? The fracture lines in normal politics are so irrelevant, virtually irrelevant on this, believe it or not. Those who know do not say, and those who say do not know. Another wonderful Lao Tzu quote. But the truth is, those who are involved in these projects on both sides of the aisle are never going to talk about it. And the ones who aren't going to know, and if they find out, like Clinton did and Kennedy did and Carter did, a bunch of them did, Eisenhower, you name it, they're not going to have any power over it. All the way back to Eisenhower. Here's a 5-star general and 2-term conservative, Republican, pro-military president. And when he left office, he told Brigadier General Lubkin, who's one of our witnesses, you can get his tape and see it, that this whole thing was out of his hands and that it was out of control and that it would not be in the best of hands. And so it has turned out to be. I think that one of the things I would like to do, if we can get people in the experimental energy world to actually come up with a workable system, is to put out in front of the world sometime this fall an operational zero-point energy device that's robust enough to squash any skepticism. Now, we have some that we're looking at right now, but they're not robust enough to squash all skepticism. And so what we're looking for are some scientists in the white world, like Bearden's team and others, to bring to the next stage a device, say a kilowatt system, that would be extracting energy from the zero-point energy field and would be independently vetted by 4 or 5 different institutions that we already have lined up that are clean institutions that'll do this. And then bring that out, you know, like a September, October surprise, and it'll rock. It would rock this, because people realize, you know, we don't need to have, you know, I was looking at the news today and it's all these and I have a nephew over there in Iraq right now, cannon fodder for oil war number whatever, and it's so pitiful what's happening to the whole thinking behind the way we're going to solve this problem. You can punch 1,000 more holes in the ground, and you're never going to keep up with the demand that China and India present by themselves over the next 10 years for oil. So the solution is that we're going to have to bring forward a definitive replacement for fossil fuels and nuclear power. Good news is we have it. Bad news is it's locked away in a box. Ben Rich, everyone know who Ben Rich was, the head of Lockheed Skunk Works, a super secret. Ben Rich said point blank prior to his death to 3 people who are on my team, he said, we already have the means to travel among the stars, faster than the speed of light. But those technologies are locked away in ultra-secret projects, and it would take an act of God to ever get them out to benefit the human race. Now, I have 3 witnesses to him saying this. I have other people who've actually worked in those Lockheed projects. It means that, however, that even though these things have gone on covertly with a lot of muscle behind keeping them secret, you know what the wonderful thing about the laws of the universe and science and nature is that they're universal. Anyone can discover them, and they do. I have told people that there have been hundreds of people from the late 1800s to now who have stumbled across this, quote, over-unity effect, where an electromagnetic generator taps into the structure of space, where there's this electromagnetic potential in the quantum vacuum space around us here, or the zero-point energy field, and have gotten a machine that runs in excess of what it should be putting out. This has been happening through accidental experiments and discoveries for decades. The problem is there's always a very well-entrenched kleptocracy that moves in, takes over that device, puts it into a black shelf, or murders the inventor, or threatens the hell out of them, and it never comes out to you people. One of the people I met with last year sent his private helicopter to land at my estate out here in Virginia. And I have all this land out here in one of these houses out near Monticello, and that's where I hide. And he brought his helicopter in and took a whole bag of all my testimony and stuff, and then flew me over to meet the scion of this family, who's a billionaire. He says, man, I hope you succeed. He says, I can't be involved too much in this. He says, because of my alliances. He says, but I was with the head of General Motors in the 60s. And he told me point blank they had a system they could put in every car they made in the 60s so that it would run on absolute, like a hydrogen fuel cell type thing. And the only emissions would be some water vapor. They had that technology, and he was hell-bent to go ahead and bring it out because it was time that happened. 2 weeks later, that man was dead. It was said to be a suicide, and it was not. It was a murder. And this guy, this old 80-some-year-old industrialist, knows the details of that. Those are the people I meet with all the time. And what I have found is that we have got to put together enough people around a machine so that it can be done safely. Now you ask, why does that matter? Because secrecy folds in on itself and becomes self-perpetuating. And this is why what I do, if it's significant, gets dumped into the public domain as quickly as we can. Why? You would think, oh, when you want to keep this secret? I said, on the contrary. It's the secrecy that creates the highest risk profile. Think about it. If you've got several million people or several 100 million people who've heard about what you're doing, you're a lot safer than if you're obscure. If you're obscure, you can be made to go away. It's called an erasure. And we have people who on our team who've been part of groups that have done erasures, where people just completely disappear and never seen from again. Forget Jimmy Hoffa. More than that. And so if you're going to come forward with the technology, you have to put this system around it where the technology itself is known by a large number of people, both in terms of VIPs and sort of the power elites who are on our side. And there are a lot of power elites that are on our side. And also the masses of people, the large, just everyone out there. And luckily, we can do this today if we find a suitable machine. So far, we have not found anything that's quite what it needs to be. And I hope that we can, because if we do, it will absolutely frame not only the presidential election and all the other elections, but the whole debate going on in the world today surrounding security, terrorism, international peace, the environment, what have you. In fact, this paper I'm doing for this very prestigious international diplomatic journal is really focusing on these implications of the secrecy insofar as it has created a monster, both in terms of global conflict, but also in terms of a very frightening future environmentally that can be resolved. But people first have to learn, and then they have to get into action. And ultimately, you got to bring forward the actual physical technologies. And that's, of course, the riskiest thing to do. But that's the phase where we are now. We've got to start doing that. And you shouldn't expect General Motors or one of these other groups to do it. I would love it if they would. You know, someone said, so-and-so's going to do this. I said, I hope they succeed. But until they do, we have a strategic team who can do it if someone actually has a machine that works. So any of you who know of something legitimate, see me and we'll talk. Legitimate, let me define it. Not a black box, can be independently verified and reproduced, real science, is functioning today, not theoretical in the back of an envelope, and is definitively and unambiguously over unity. In other words, puts out more energy than the amount that man has to supply by it extracting energy from the quantum vacuum flux field. You know, by the way, the alien reproduction vehicles, the ARVs that they've been making with SAIC and Lockheed and Northrop and all these for years are called flux liners. That's their nickname, a flux liner. People say, why? I said, well, they don't have a big payload of fuel or nuclear reactor. They're tapping into this flux field or the fabric of space-time and extracting energy from that. And then by doing it in a certain way, they get an anti-gravity effect. And boom, there you go. I've been up close to these, so I know what they look like. I've got a blueprint even for one. Somebody want to write a check for a few 10 million? We'll build it. Actually, funding's the biggest problem in this area right now. Yes, sir. We made it very clear that if that kind of thing happened to us or our group, that there would be repercussions in kind or worse. And the proof of the pudding is in the fact that out of the 100 and some people who gave us their testimony, 69 of which are in this book, do you know how many people even got a phone call saying, shut up, you've got a top secret clearance, shut up, you signed an oath? 0, not one. And I think that people say, you know, there were many reasons why we did the disclosure project like we did in 2001, and one of them was to beta test that system. We were also beta testing the media to see how far they would let that story run before they took it down. So this is what you do. You kind of like, you push into, it's forward-leaning, to use a bad phrase from the military, but it's a forward-leaning stance, but it evokes responses. And I'm confident that we can do this. And this is one reason why I'm actually very confident that if we are able to acquire a functioning energy device and have people get out of the way of their own fear, it doesn't mean there won't be threats. I mean, after the Disclosure Project event, one of our chief witnesses had a 3-star general who's friendly to us tell him to tell me that I should be checking under my vehicle for bombs, that there are some people who are so pissed off that I'm likely to get blown up. And I said, oh, I'm not worried. Never worry about it. So the point I'm making is you shouldn't give this fear thing any more traction than it already has. And I believe that there's a window open here that's open just for a little while for us to move this stuff out, disclose it, and get the technologies out. And if that window decisively closes and we don't succeed in that, it'll be too late and we will be past V1, the takeoff point, and our civilization will go through some kind of a terminal sequence, shutdown sequence for a while before it restarts. That's a bit ominous to say, but I mean, I think that if you just logically look at the trends, the meta trends going on, even the Pentagon recently came out with this paper talking about catastrophic, sudden changes in the environment due to the melting of the polar ice caps and the shutting off of the Gulf Stream. I mean, and causing the Europe to be thrown into an ice age while the rest of the world got all totally turned upside down. This is something that very mainstream science and military planners are looking at as sort of the worst scenario, and that it could happen suddenly. So I think that we're really, people say, aren't you really being very visionary about this stuff about communication with other life forms and bringing out these Jetson-like technology? I said, no. When I was born in 1955, that's my age, 48, that technology could have already been applied. And I woke up as a little child knowing that that was possible. I knew there was something profoundly wrong with the world as a little kid. I don't know what, and that there were things that weren't. And then when I was 8 years old, I saw one of these, sort of ovoid-shaped, beautiful, seamless silver craft, silent, daytime. And I knew that I had seen the future in there, in a sense, maybe literally as well as figuratively, because if space can be non-locally transported around, so can time. This is another discussion. And the best way to do it is through higher states of consciousness and the dream state. And the Aboriginals of Australia know this very well, and so does every other native people. Anyone that hasn't been screwed up with conventional religiosity understands this. But, ooh, ouch, did I say that? Redact. But, ouch. Yeah, next week I'm dictating a book at my home. We have about 25 people at the house for a week. My poor wife is cooking for everyone for a week. It's like having 5, 6 Thanksgiving dinners in a row. But what I'm going to do is sit down and talk about everything I know for about 40 hours. Every name, every facility, every experience I've ever had. And I'm just going to put it out there. And the purpose is not to do this so it's secret. The purpose is to put it out there and then get it out to the public. It won't be all pretty. It's a wonderful, it's a tragic comedy. It's inspiring, but it's tragic and it's comical and it's crazy. And quite frankly, I'm just like worn out by it at this point. As my nurses in the ER in North Carolina used to say, that man's getting on my last whole nerve. This stuff's been getting on my last whole nerve. But I got some great ER stories, too. You want to hear them? Sometime late at night, we'll talk. The kinkiest things ever. I want to write a book. It's going to be ER South, S-O-U-T-H, with the letters like that, talking about all the hilarious things I saw in the ER in North Carolina all those years. Yes, ma'am.
Within the groups that you get together and go out to different spots to
Yes.
try to do contacts and stuff, has anybody ever been taken aboard any ships? And then my other question is, in relationship to time travel, what are your thoughts on extraterrestrials being actually us from the future?
She's asked 2 questions. What kind of experiences have we had in terms of people contacting or being on a craft when we've gone out on these expeditions? The answer is that has happened in a way that if I described it to you, with probably 80% of you, I'd lose all credibility. Let's just say non-locality is the answer. And if you understand non-locality in consciousness, matter, space, and time, you'll understand what I'm saying. But yes, those things have happened, but they're high. J. Allen Hynek, Dr. Hynek used to say high strangeness. I can really tell an ARV very easily. They're so crude and primitive compared to the actual extraterrestrial capabilities, which are like something out way past anything portrayed in Close Encounters of the Third Kind or Star Trek. And if you're actually engaged with that phenomenon, and people say, oh, it's interdimensional. Well, they don't understand what dimensions are. In a sense, the dimension is a construct of our own awareness. There's a singularity of everything that exists, and the secret is conscious awareness, mind. Erwin Schrödinger said the total number of minds in the universe is 1. And in reality, matter, even at the subatomic level, photon, space, time, all of it is a singularity of awakeness modulating in a different way. Now, we're going to get kind of weird here if we go too far down this path. But before I went into medicine, I was a Vedic scholar. And I used to teach Sanskrit. And was a meditation instructor. I had my misspent youth. But, people like Louise Hay were students of mine. And it was interesting because as a young kid, I had some experiences that proved this to me. Absolutely proved experientially that non-locality is a reality, that everything is actually non-local, that there's no separation in space or time once you understand how everything is integrated around the singularity of awakeness, mind. Native peoples call it the Great Spirit. You can call it what you will, but that is true, and it can be experienced. Now, there are technological implications to that. Let me tell you a little cute story. Can I sit down? Yeah. I got to take my coat off, too. It's hot in here. I tell you, I'm having a hot flash again. It's male menopause. What happened is that my meeting with the CIA director, one of the most interesting things about it was that his wife was the head of the National Academy of Sciences, chief operating officer. So one of the chiefs there, and Sue Woolsey. And we were sitting, and of course, the cover story was a dinner thing, so we had to have dinner. And of course, the house was surrounded. I was so naive. I didn't realize the Secret Service were going to stay there the whole damn time surrounding this place where we were. There they were. And we were having the meeting, and she finally asked me this question. She says, well, Dr. Greer, how are these people, extraterrestrial life forms, communicating through interstellar distances? And this is where I had to come to grips with something very difficult. Do I tell a white lie and maintain my credibility? Or do I tell the truth and lose all my credibility? I decided if she was mature enough to ask the question, I should be a stand-up enough guy to answer it honestly. So I looked at her and I said, well, you know, the distance across our own galaxy, you know, our solar system with the sun and Mars and Earth is one star out of billions within our galaxy, the Milky Way, is, you know, 100,000 light years. That's the distance a beam of light travels at 186,000 miles every second for 100,000 years. It's a big distance. And I said, if a star system is only 1,000 light years from here, 1% of the way through our own galaxy, and that's where these life forms are from, 1,000 light years away. At the speed of light, for home base to say, hi, how are you doing? And for the extraterrestrial vehicle to answer back, oh, very well, thank you. That just took how long? 2,000 years, the time since the birth of Christ. It's not viable. And she says, well, then how are they doing it? I said, they're using sub-electromagnetic systems that are actuating a non-local and scalar type energy wave that also happens to be within the nexus of conscious intelligence. And they can literally think to a control panel or be near it and communicate non-locally across hundreds of thousands or millions or billions of light years of space. And I was expecting her to laugh at me, fall out of the chair, and say, this guy's a complete head case. And she looked at me and she says, you know, I thought it had to be something like that. God bless women. She got it. I think her husband, you know, the CIA director, was going, uh-huh. So, but anyway, I think there are a lot of people who can even understand this stuff today that, you know, 100 years ago would have been pretty mysterious. But technologically, you know, at CERN, near Geneva, the big lab, they have been able to kind of teleport particles. Well, I got news for you. I got a witness, and he's in the disclosure book that we have out there, who was at an Air Force facility in Canada in 1953. I was not a twinkle in my father's eye, who literally saw them, quote, dematerialize and then rematerialize an object across a distance at this facility using electronics. And these were not the state-of-the-art stuff even for 53. This was a minor experiment he stumbled across, and he witnessed it personally. And I have other people who've witnessed more exotic things in the late 40s and 50s. So when I say to people, the world we live in is a faint shadow, a faint sort of wisp of the world we could have and already do have. I'm not talking about something that has to descend from on high from the Empyrean realm. We got it. It's here. The future is here. It's been here for almost 100 years. But there are people who have hijacked that future. And so here we sit, messing our own nest, cannibalizing the planet, fighting over X barrels of oil when we don't need the junk, while these wondrous sciences are locked away in the hands of a kleptocracy of folks who are hell-bent on maintaining this death grip on control. And they're going to pull the whole thing down if we don't say enough. That's really what we have to do. Did that answer your question? Well, I answered one question.
The second question was just in regards to time travel, whether or not you feel that extraterrestrials are actually us or other entities.
Well, regarding time travel or some of the ETs that people see us from the future, the answer is yes and no. Some are and some aren't. But remember this. I mean, one of the things that I said many, many years ago, and it was sort of the centerpiece of this lecture that I did years ago up in New York, is that we are all essentially one. If you understand the nature of consciousness and the fact that there's this plasticity of time and space, all intelligent life is essentially the same. Because within it, if you're awake, you can be aware of awakeness. And if you can be in that state, it's been called samadhi, the Christians call it the beatific state, then you can be at any point in space, at any point in time, and you can be any other being. This collapses. The conventional wisdom on everything is wrong, in my opinion. From reincarnation to spirit, everything is wrong. Everything, virtually. So I just keep my mouth shut most of the time because I piss so many people off. But the understanding of non-locality allows you to understand not only how these technologies are operating across distances of space and time, but also how, in some cases, there are things that have happened where there's an indication that they are actually outside of this point in time space, or I should say time, and are moved off the timeline. Now, is this possible? Yes, there's something called Operation Looking Glass that you may have probably haven't heard of, but we have witnesses who are part of this project out west that was running out of the Nellis facility and some other facilities where they were experimenting and had acquired some of the extraterrestrial technologies and were specifically experimenting with this kind of capability. Unfortunately, these are folks that you wish didn't have this ability. So, and this is the other thing I say to people who say, these technologies sound like they could be pretty dangerous. They are, and they're in the worst of hands already. One of the things that Eisenhower said is that this whole matter not only wasn't in his control, he says, but it's not in the best of hands. It's going to be in the worst of hands. And he said this, and we have a witness who was there when he said it. And the problem is that that's what's happened, and it's only through people being intimidated, such as presidents and senators and media people. I've been actually mortified at the lack of courage of some of the people who claim to be investigative reporters and who I will put on a silver platter 10 years of research and sources and documents and military deep throats. If they had 3 of them about a tryst that a senator had with a bimbo, it would be front page for a year, nonstop in every media. But if you give them 150 of them on digital videotape and say, here, go with this story, they don't touch it. This is corruption. It's absolutely corrupt. So this, the thing is that we have the ability to move our civilization into a fantastic point in time and space. But it's being held up. And there are certain key things that have to happen to make that reality occur. One of them is a disclosure of the information. But equally important one is a demonstration and disclosure of the technology. And that's why we're working on that, because that is ultimately, for every person who might be interested in UFOs and extraterrestrial life and this sort of arcana, there are 1 million people interested in finding a solution to the environmental and energy problem. And so the fact is the secrecy around one is identical to the secrecy around the other. There is no difference at all. I mean, people think that, they're somehow segmented. I said, no, the agenda is very much the same. It's control. It's power and control. Let's see, from this side. I can't see over here too well. Yes, ma'am. Yes.
In the earlier lecture today, you mentioned somebody named Vannevar Bush, and I don't know if he's related to the Bush family.
No.
But I know that George H.W. Bush has been around in politics, the CIA, and a lot of top secret stuff for a very long time. And now his son is the president.
Right.
And through strange means. And we now have 2 skull and bones guys come to be our choice of president.
And the more things change, the more they stay the same. Yeah. What's your question, miss?
My question is, of the 2 evils,
I really can't judge that. I can say that conventional wisdom would be that Kerry and the Democrats would be friendlier to the energy systems and to openness and ending secrecy. Except I worked extensively with the top level of the Democrats with the Clinton years, and I haven't seen it. I also have seen that whereas the Washington Post has shills on their payroll as a liberal paper that trashed the Disclosure Project event in 2001, the Washington Times, which is the arch conservative DC paper that is read by the president and everyone, had a inside the front page, a half-page article about it that was serious and respectful. So conventional wisdom may not apply, and that's why I am fiercely independent. And I am very open-minded, and I try to be non-prejudicial. Are we reaching out to folks who are friends of Bush? Yes. And are we reaching out to people who are close to Kerry? Yes. And frankly, I think that this issue is so profound and it transcends so many of the normal fracture lines that the issue about who's going to deal with it boils down to who has the courage of their convictions and are willing to stay the course, even if it costs them their life. And I've said this to people. Early on, 92, I went into meetings with the head of Army Intelligence, and I'll tell you this little story. After they found out we learned the ability to vector in these vehicles, these extraterrestrial vehicles, and interact with them, I was asked to come to a meeting, and I was sitting there with these bunch of spooks in a hotel room like this. They had asked me to come to a conference, and I couldn't figure out why I was invited. And then I found out that at the banquet thing, I was sitting between the head of Army Intelligence and a senior NSA spook and a couple other people. And later they said, would you come, like, to share some time with us? And so they brought me up to this hotel room and said, who the hell do you think you are? And I said, oh, well, I'm a citizen of this earth, and I consider myself a conscious being in the universe. And as I said, my mother's family were some of the original founders of the United States and were prisoner of war against the British in founding America. And I have every right to do what I'm doing. And if you don't like it, there's the door. Don't let it hit you in the ass as you leave. Now, I said it just like that. I mean, people who get to know me go, my God, he's a goddamn Rottweiler. But, for a good reason, I can be a nice guy when I want to be. But I can be tough when I need to be. And basically I said, look, let me tell you something, buddy. And I turned right then. Here's this guy, the head of Army Intelligence, who's been involved since the 60s. Not the current one, it's the past one. Who'd been involved since he was a young man, recruited into this shadow government. And I looked at him and I said, I have been up close and personal with these objects, and so you can't fool me about them or why they're here or the fact that they're real. That's number one. I said, number two, I'm not rich, but I'm wealthy enough as a doctor. I don't need your damn money, so you can't buy me off. And I said, number three, when I was 17, I was deathly ill, had a near-death experience, left my body, had an amazing experience. I was raised a very devout atheist, but had an experience that was really sort of a God consciousness experience that changed my life. And I said, so I'm not afraid of death because I know there is no death. So if you want to whack me, go ahead. And he looked at me, and he crossed his arms like this, the body language. He said, well, we know exactly who this son of a bitch is. I said, yeah, that's right. What are you going to do about it? So, there's a time and place for that kind of behavior. And so the bottom line is, I don't think that this issue is unresolvable. What's been unresolvable is the lack of courage and vision amongst people who should know better by now. And that includes most of us. And I say to people, it's not just, you can't just look to the leadership and say it's their fault, because they have their own problems and agendas. Everyone is responsible for getting this information out and resolving it and holding people's feet to the fire. And believe me, it took a lot of courage for me, even as a medical doctor. Here I am, chairman of emergency medicine at a very busy hospital, taking care of serious stuff. It's not like I'm a psychiatrist, doing abduction research. All right? I mean, this is life and death stuff. People come to me, and they're in bad shape. And, all of a sudden I'm on Larry King Live and stuff talking about ETs and UFOs, and it's like, I have people going, is this guy? Luckily, I'd established myself as a very good physician before I kind of came out of the closet on this stuff. But the bottom line is that you have to have the courage of your convictions and to speak, and there can be costs. I know people who've lost their careers. I know people who've been terminated because they spoke out of turn on this. My military advisor, when he was down at a facility in Key West, was told by his higher up that there are two things that will terminate your career in the military or intelligence, and that is to get on this particular computer system and make an inquiry into UFOs or POW MIA issues. Those two things, and you're gone. That's the end of your career. And that's another long story. So the point I'm making is that this issue requires people to walk the walk. I mean, and unfortunately, it's an issue that's fascinating. One of my, I was asked by an Australian broadcasting system not long ago what the most disappointing thing about all this was for me. And I said, well, it's being with very competent, smart people, and in many cases powerful people, who, even though they will turn to me and say, this absolutely should be done, they won't do it. And they won't do it because they're trying to protect their reputation or their credibility or their career path or their pension or their power or what have you. Believe it or not, I had a meeting with a senior National Science Foundation director and one of the directors of NASA, one of the 5 directors of NASA. And we flew them out to a place on the ocean in Santa Barbara, at a house there that was a suitable place to sit and schmooze for a day. And towards the end of it, they said, I have no doubt this is true. And we went through all the implications. One of these people was in charge of studying climate change and pollution, and with National Science Foundation. And they said, and I said, well, what can you do to help us? And they said, oh, no, we can't do anything. We want to learn, but, it would ruin our careers. I said, one hand, my career, one hand, the future of the biosphere of the Earth. My career, the future of the biosphere. I mean, give me a goddamn break. But, the problem is, excuse my language, but the fact is, it's been very frustrating for me. I tell people it's been traumatic. I have a type of disclosure post-traumatic stress syndrome personally. No, I do, actually, of having dealt with this, and, I'm being thrown into this situation for whatever reason, and, being expecting to give briefings to, senators and all these sort of people, and I do it. Anyone who wants to open a door, I'll walk through the door and I'll do it. The problem is that when you leave, I always say, now what can you do to help us? It doesn't translate into action, and it's that inaction. This is where I'm getting to with your question. If President Bush tomorrow wanted to become one of the greatest leaders in the history of the earth, he could insist on bringing this out. And even if he got threatened, say, bring it on to him, not to the boys over dying in Iraq. Kerry the same thing, Clinton the same thing, all of them the same thing. They have the power. And actually, and this is one of the things I said to the CIA director, he said, well, what are we supposed to do if we don't have access to these projects? I said, you get access. And I'll help you. I'll give you the name, project numbers. How hard is that? Let me tell you what I did a few years ago. The head of intelligence joint staff wanted me to brief. I did a stand-up briefing. You know what a stand-up briefing is? I mean, literally, you stand up, you do a briefing. It's really tight, very military. Never done one before. It was my first one, and they loved it. And a military and ER is kind of light. You have to be very disciplined to do it and put up with a lot of crap. And at the end of it, before this meeting started, I spoke to his aide, his senior aide, and I had given a briefing packet. I always do this before I go into a meeting, try to get briefing materials before the meeting, because then they can do their homework. And I'll say, I'm very funny about it. I say, this is the admiral's homework, or this is the general's reading assignment for the next week, and then I'll come. And this man said that, well, what can he do to find out what's really happening? I said, does he want the code names? I got a document that lists the code numbers and code names of these projects. And I will give him also the specific corporations and their facilities and the sub-facilities where it's going on. He looked at me, he says, you know all that? I said, of course. It's what I'm supposed to know. I just do it. I've got hundreds of sources, 450 deep throats. Okay, so I put this together. Sure enough, the admiral, who was head of intelligence joint staff, contacted and identified within the Pentagon one of these clandestine shadowy cells dealing with this subject. And it wasn't an old code name because it was operative. And the person at the other end of the phone said, well, yes, sir, yes. They couldn't deny it anymore because he had them dead to rights. He says, but you don't have a need to know. And he was furious. This is the J2, the head of intelligence joint staff. Hello. He was told to his face, sir, you don't have a need to know. Now, that's the kind of stuff that I've dealt with. Now, when I met with him, he told me this story, and I said, well, the admiral needs to insist on knowing. He says, but he can't get around that system without having the political leaders direct him to penetrate it. And they won't do it because they're terrified. It is the biggest mess in Washington. I don't know how many of you live in Washington. I have a place there. But it's a very dysfunctional situation. But ultimately, I tell people, then you do what you need to do. I mean, I had someone give me years ago a top secret document that had not been declassified, and it was taken from the National Security Agency. And when someone learned that I was going to put that on the street, they went, "Are you crazy? You'll go to jail." I said, "Oh, good. Wonderful. Come put the bracelets on." Because my first call will be to Ted Koppel or to Larry King or someone. And there'll be a few million people watching me have the perp walk being taken to jail. And it will confirm the authenticity of the smoking gun document. I said, make my day. Come on. And what happened, of course, is that nothing happened. I did get an FBI guy contact me. He says, it's a X $1,000 fine and X number of years in prison if you disclose the contents of this, da-da-da-da-da-da. I said, really? We've declared that project extra-constitutional. A priori, it's illegal. A priori, it cannot cite the National Security Act to protect itself anymore. And that's our legal argument. And no one, the constitutional attorneys I've dealt with, none of them have been able to find an argument with that, because we can prove that the chain of command at the Pentagon is routinely decapitated. I can prove presidents have been, and oversight committees, like the Senate Intelligence Committee members I've met with, have been decapitated. If that's the case, the operation's extra-constitution and illegal. If it's illegal, it cannot cite a law to protect itself. You see what I'm saying? So all these men who have signed national security secrecy orders around this subject, I unilaterally declared them null and void. I did. And that's how they started coming forward. People say, Micah, now, some would call that chutzpah, but that's all right. I said, but it's a legitimate position to take, because if we can prove that that's the situation, then isn't it appropriate for us as people to say, look, they can't hide behind this sort of matrix of illusion any longer. And they've created the specter of fear and all this inner sort of this web of secrecy as if it has legitimacy. But it has lost its legitimacy as soon as they opted out of the legal constitutional authority, which they have. Therefore, they're the rogues, they're the terrorists, they're the outlaws, and we need to stand them down. Yes, ma'am. About who? I like to not talk about individual people like that unless, but yeah, I mean, obviously people know a lot more than whatever gets reported in the mainstream press. I'll give you a hint. There's a book out there on the table called Disclosure. There's an unemphasized document in there, and they're listed in that and a few other documents. They're there. Well, that one was as of the 1990s. Now, I was in the 90s when I met with this admiral, who was J2, head of intelligence. So whether they've now, of course, I'm sure since I blew the whistle on that, they probably changed those names. I don't know. They may be the same, but they were current as of the early. Let's see. I met with him. We did the congressional briefings in '97, and the day after that, I went over there on April 10th or whatever it was, and met with this admiral. And that's so as of that date, they were current. Yes. Right.
I was certainly very fired up to
but it could still be pretty bad. I mean, the question is, how bad will it be before there couldn't be some intervention? I'm personally the reason I don't like that line of thinking is that it develops what I call cosmic codependency. And I think that we as humans need to empower ourselves to fix this mess that we've created. Would an extraterrestrial group or several groups watching this happen try to intervene in a worst case scenario? Yes. I think there were nuclear things that happened from my intelligence sources in the old Atomic Energy Commission and elsewhere, where events were truncated or where interceptions occurred to keep a thermonuclear event from getting out of control. And I have good reason to think this is very much the case. So that's true. On the other hand, it's not as if they're going to, people, Larry King or someone will say, well, why don't they land on the White House lawn? And no. I said, well, if they did, first of all, they'd be shot out of the sky before they got there, even before 9/11. And secondly, if they were to intervene in a way that's more direct, before we quit lying to each other, it will be spun as Alien Invasion Week on the Discovery Channel. What's going to happen is that they're going to say, see, there's a threat from outer space, and we need $5 trillion out of the global economy over the next decade to build our weapon systems to shoot and kick alien butt, a la the movie Independence Day. And about half the stuff you hear at a conference like this is fear-mongering stuff designed to support people's thinking, in my opinion, of creating a new enemy in space. They are desperate to move off planet with conflict into space. And this is what's been going on for 30 or 40 years. It's a very, very dangerous thing. And I think that extraterrestrial civilizations are advanced enough to know that you cannot intervene that directly without it causing many probably more problems than they're trying to solve. And therefore, those of us who are the children of Earth have the primary obligation and responsibility to fix this problem. This is not to say that if things really melted down that there wouldn't be some help or some intervention. But I think that this is not something I would want. That's the last resort. That's the end. It's like we say in the ER, Levofed leaves them dead. At the very end of the algorithm, when you got to use this particular drug, yeah, you'll get the heart started back, but it's going to knock off the kidneys, it's going to knock off this, it's going to knock off everything. So, if we get there, that's the end of the algorithm. So let's be wiser than that and just quit lying about these things, get the information out, and work together to get these technologies out. I'll remind you that right now on the planet, there are probably a dozen scientists, not in black projects, who know how to build these devices. But they're too afraid to come forward. We're trying to reach out to them. Or they've already been intercepted by eschatologists who have convinced them to keep their technology secret until 5 billion people are wiped off the face of the earth in an environmental catastrophe. True. There are two major scientists who have these things that's what they believe. They say, oh no, we can't do it until... So it's this crazy eschatological paradigm that has been sort of pushed onto them, and they've been convinced because the psychology is, well, if that's true, then I'll just be safe and be quiet for now and take the few $1 million and do my little thing. So, look, there are people out there who know this stuff. We've got to explain to enough folks who may understand these technologies why it needs to happen now, and not to get into either cosmic codependency or big brother codependency. It's somehow at the right time, some magnanimous group out of the shadow government is going to let this stuff out and benefit the world. I mean, if they had a beneficial perspective, it would have been done by 1955. By the mid-50s, the technologies were known, were fully developed, and could have been brought out, and they weren't. And now we're into this era of some of these unintended consequences. And believe me, there's a large number of people within this covert structure who agree with us that this information should come out. But they're still a minority. They're still under 50%, in my opinion. And unfortunately, in the worst 5% of that crowd are so murderous that when people try to defect with the real goods, they get into a buzzsaw. And unfortunately, I believe that's what happened to Bill Colby. Yes, ma'am.
This shadow group that has a death grip on this information, is it international?
Yes.
That's what I thought.
Is the group international? Yes. And if someone asked me to rank order the relevancy and power of membership, way at the bottom would be former CIA Director Bush, the current president's father, who's sort of a mid-level apparatchik in this affair. There, I said it on the record. But the real action are with these sort of institutionalized think tanks, financial entities, and certain religious entities.
So can I just further that with a,
Yep.
I'm always, well, not always, but I have a consistent question in my mind. One gets the feeling that somebody is running the world and you don't know who it is. It sounds to me like this is who's running the world.
Correct. But it's the Wizard of Oz phenomenon. I mean, it has the power we've ceded to it. You know, you remember the Wizard of Oz when they finally pull back the thing and there's this old man there pulling all these levers and stuff? I'm not saying they don't have real power, but a lot of it, all power is illusory, really. I mean, my philosophy is that real power resides with God and with the divine being, and the rest of it is just a joke. But the point is, these groups have enormous amounts of influence. And they are in it for different reasons. Don't think this is a homogenous agenda. There are some agendas that are religious or paradigm based. There are other agendas that are military, others are technological, corporate, financial. Others have to do with just fear of change, plain old inertia. Because you're not talking about a small change here. There's one reason why I'm actually I'm empathetic to the position of those maintaining the secrecy. I don't agree with it, but I have empathy for it, because back about 14 years ago when I stepped in, well, about 12 years ago when I stepped into a level of this where I was asked, and I'm telling you for a fact, top people in this group, as well as some other folks, asked me to do what I'm doing. And because they wanted, well, I'm cannon fodder. See, I'm expendable. First of all, I'm not important. And since I'm not important, I don't have any position in the world that's important. I just am a country doctor in Virginia. And so that means I can do this stuff. But what they are really saying is that they want to have this happen. But they're, as one admiral said, just wait until I retire. I want to go fishing in Montana. This is going to be a huge change, and we don't want to manage it. Now, this was a guy who was in charge of the security for all the continental United States. He says, just keep the, my job is really maintaining the status quo of the energy grid of the world. Now, there's an admiral who was also head of naval research who said this. And just don't rock the boat. Wait till I retire at least. So basically, you know, you have to step in everyone's shoes, see what kind of change this would be. And here's the problem. Had this been done in the 40s and 50s, it could have been phased in a lot more easily than now. Why? Because the world is 100-fold or more, 1,000-fold more dependent on fossil fuels. It's more wired with a centralized utility grid. The scale of economic integration is like it's never been. To do this now is much more difficult than it would have been in the 40s and 50s. And so these poor guys who are in this position now, who inherited this bag of crap, are going, yeah, it should be done, but hell if I'm going to do it. So here's the problem. Your question is such a great one, this thing about which Politico or this or that. It's all up for grabs. And basically it boils down to courage, willing to stay the course, and basically willing to take the hit. Whether it's social opprobrium, or whether it's credibility hit, or losing a promotion in your career, or defying your boss. I mean, this is really what it's about. And I have to say, and I haven't said this yet, I have enormous respect for the Disclosure Project witnesses, a couple of whom are actually at this conference, who have had the courage to step forward in front of the mass media and in front of the public and tell the truth about what they saw, about what they've heard, about what they've learned. It takes a lot of courage to do that on a subject that is the butt of many jokes on Jay Leno and what have you. I mean, even the Comedy Central had a joke about me during the Disclosure Project. You know, and my daughters saw it, were mortified. You know, I have 4 daughters, and I said, oh, those, I just ignore them. You have to get pretty thick-skinned, but you also have to be willing to go the distance. And this is the big problem. People will understand why this is important, but will they translate that understanding into action? Well, you know what I say to people? Let us be those who provide the example of courage. We may not be a CEO of a big corporation or a big person in Washington or what have you, but we can show our courage and through that become an inspiration to all of these other people. And believe me, they are watching us. They're looking at what we're doing. So we have to do that. And if the leaders won't lead, let the people lead and they'll follow. And that's true. So it's time that we empower ourselves. And I'm convinced that in this room right now, if everyone in this room committed to investigating and doing everything they could in their circles to get this information out, identify scientists who are in your hometown who've stumbled across these technologies and they're locked away in a basement, we could do this in 12 months. But it takes more people than are currently putting their shoulder to the wheel. We need your help, and we welcome it. Thank you very much. God bless you.